so we need to believe what he says. So as we study on how to master temptation, who better to look to than Jesus, who absolutely did face temptation time and time again, but got through it perfectly. And so what I want to do is we'll start by reading the 11 verses here of Matthew chapter 4. We'll get the whole story in our minds as we continue on. But we're going to break this up the next 3 nights into each temptation. And the reason that we're going to do that is because I think within each temptation you find just very striking things, very striking lessons. Not just in the temptation itself, but in the answer that Jesus gives. Now we're going to kind of look at this from a whole, but more specifically look at the kind of narrow our study on the first temptation, the first tactic of Satan here as we go throughout the lesson. But let's just go ahead and read beginning in verse 1 of Matthew chapter 4. In verse 1 of Matthew chapter 4, it says, "Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. And after he had fasted 40 days and 40 nights, he then became hungry. And the tempter came and said to him, 'If you are the Son of God, command these stones become bread.' But he answered and said, 'It is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God.' Then the devil took him into the holy city and had him stand on the pinnacle of the temple. And he said to him, 'If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down. For it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, so that you will not strike your foot against a stone.' Jesus said to him, 'On the other hand, it is written, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test.' Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. And he said to him, 'All these things I will give you if you fall down and worship me.' Then Jesus said to him, 'Go, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God and serve him only.' Then the devil left him, and behold, angels came and began to minister to him." Now, again, I just wanted to get the entire story in our minds as we continue on, because at the very outset, what I want to do is just look at the entirety of the story to understand, I think, exactly what's kind of happening here. First of all, as we kind of break this down, what we find is what I think is a consistent lesson throughout the Bible. Not just when you get to Matthew chapter 4. But Jesus, as he is led into the wilderness, it is in the midst of fasting. It is in the midst of, obviously trying circumstances that that Satan decides, this is the time. This is when I want to strike. This is when I want to tempt. And so why is that? Well, first of all, before we get into the why necessarily, I do just want to notice the language that Jesus himself uses. Every single time he is tempted by the devil, what does he do? He quotes Scripture. And I do think that there's an interesting fact here, something to know. When you look back at all of the quotations that he makes, they reside within the book of Deuteronomy. And if you want to go ahead and turn back there, I just want to read this very quickly, giving some context to these quotations that he gives. First of all, in Deuteronomy chapter 8, this is what we're going to be focusing on mainly today, but at the beginning in verse 1, it says, "All the commandments that I am commanding you today, you shall be careful to do, that you may live and multiply, and go in and possess the land which the Lord swore to give to your forefathers. You shall remember all the way which the Lord your God has led you in the wilderness these 40 years, that he might humble you, testing you, to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. He humbled you and let you be hungry and fed you with manna which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you understand that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by everything that proceeds out of the mouth of the Lord." And so we get a little bit of context to the very last part of which we read, the part that Jesus actually quotes when he is tempted in the first case. Well, going back just a page, in Deuteronomy chapter 6, beginning in verse 10, here, it says, "Then it shall come about when the Lord your God brings you into the land which he swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give you, great and splendid cities which you did not build, and houses full of all good things which you did not fill, and hewn cisterns which you did not dig, vineyards and olive trees which you did not plant, and you eat and are satisfied. Then watch yourself, that you do not forget the Lord who brought you from the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall fear only the Lord your God, and you shall worship him and swear by his name. You shall not follow other gods, any of the gods of the peoples who surround you. For the Lord your God in the midst of you is a jealous God. Otherwise, the anger of the Lord your God will be kindled against you, and he will wipe you off the face of the earth." In verse 16, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test, as you tested him at Massah. You should diligently keep the commandments of the Lord your God and his testimonies and his statutes, which he has commanded you. Now, within just these few verses here in Deuteronomy chapter 6, what you find is both of them, one right after the other, really, both of the other quotations that Jesus makes or quotations that Jesus makes when he is tempted by the devil. Now, all of this just to say, I think it's interesting, as you read through the context of these quotations, it is, you frequently get this idea of, remember when you come into this land that I gave to you. Remember how it is not you that won these things. Remember that it is me that actually gave you the victory. And remember that it is by my power, not yours, so that you don't start to boast, so that you don't become prideful and think that it is that you were a great nation. No, you weren't. It was all me. Now, all that just to say, really what I would kind of label this as, it's wilderness language. Remember when Deuteronomy is written, Moses is just, I think, reminding the people, many reminders throughout Deuteronomy, but he's reminding the people of their history, particularly as they've been wandering throughout the wilderness, of how God has given them the victory, and how ultimately they can't forget that when they do take the land. Otherwise, all these blessings that they've enjoyed, for one thing, it'll kind of be for naught. But secondly, because he will bring the curse should they disobey, and you even see that especially when you get to Mount Ebal toward the end of Deuteronomy, as that certain covenant is made, where they acknowledge that if they do go astray from the Lord, that these curses will come upon them. They acknowledge that. And so he uses wilderness language. Incidentally, well, I would say he is in the wilderness. That is where he is. There's, I think, a consistent theme of God's children being tempted or being tested in the wilderness. Just going back to Matthew chapter 4, in verse 1, again, it says that Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil, and after he had fasted 40 days and 40 nights, he then became hungry. I think there's serious parallels between Jesus being tempted in the wilderness and the children of Israel as they were wandering through the wilderness. And I think that one of the tie-ins is the fact that he quotes from Deuteronomy every time. Well, if you're suffering in the wilderness, if you are suffering from whatever the affliction may be, from hunger, from fasting, from thirst, what better book to repeat? What better mantra to have than the words of those who did suffer the same things, and sound words that give you encouragement. And so that's just one thing. But also just the circumstances. How long was Jesus in? We already see he was there for 40 days and 40 nights. How long was Israel in the wilderness? 40 years. And so even there, I think there's a parallel there where we see a similarity given between Jesus and Israel. Not only that, but they were led into the wilderness by God. As we just read in verses 1 and 2 of chapter 4, it says that the Spirit led Jesus into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. And then you have literally God leading his people. He delivered, and we know that story very well as God leads his people out of Egypt. He breaks the bonds of Egypt, and he delivers them in such marvelous, spectacular ways. And even after that, he provides for them in more miraculous ways by providing the bread from heaven, the manna from the heaven, and bringing water from the rock, which we'll read more about in just a moment from 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And so even here, what you find is at least from the beginning, what you find is in the fact that they are led into the wilderness by God, even that is a parallel. And I think all of this is for a purpose. But not only that, you find that they were tempted all along the way, and incidentally, in the same ways. I think ultimately, hopefully what we'll find within this study is that all the ways that Jesus is tempted here is the exact ways that we are still tempted today. Now, it may not be literally the exact same, where we are in a desert and we're in the wilderness and we are fasting for 40 days. But the tactics that Satan uses, I think that is definitely the same today. Well, I think that ultimately, as if you want to go ahead and turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 10, not only is there a parallel between the children of Israel wandering through the wilderness and Jesus, but I think, as we were just saying a moment ago, I think that you see that we also have, there's a parallel to our own lives, that we too are wandering in the wilderness to a degree. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, as it talks about these things, look at what Paul says. In verse 1, he says, "For I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they were drinking from a spiritual rock which followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them God was not well pleased, for they were laid low in the wilderness. Now these things happened as examples for us, so that we would not crave evil things as they also craved. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and stood up to play. Nor let us act immorally, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in one day. Nor let us try the Lord, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the serpents. Nor grumble, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as an example." That's twice he said this. "And they were written for our instruction, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed that he does not fall." First of all, when you're talking about parallels, as Paul is bringing up the manna that they ate and the water that they drank, what does he say that was? Only that was Christ. And so even there's a very strong parallel. But ultimately he says in a couple different ways, these things are given to us as examples for us to learn from. And I think it's still the same for us today. As Paul says in Philippians chapter 3, aren't we citizens of another kingdom? Aren't we citizens just trying to get to that heavenly kingdom and waiting for our departure? And so I think that there's so many strong applications for us to make here. As you look at Jesus in the wilderness, when you look at the temptations that he suffers through, those are the same temptations that we can learn to suffer through and endure. Not only that, but in just the way that he suffers through them, the way that he endures, we need to pick up these tactics that Jesus uses. So all that just to say, or get to the point, there's an interesting thought as you go back to Matthew chapter 4, this notion of temptation, whether Jesus is being tempted or tested. It says in verse 2, or rather in verse 1, at the very end of verse 1, that the Spirit led him into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. Now, I think that there is some confusion every now and then is when some people read that, they say, well, I thought that God never tempts. And guess what? You're right. God does not tempt anyone with evil. He cannot be tempted with evil. We're going to go to James chapter 1 in just a moment. But I wanted to look I wanted to maybe get a better answer for that when I first came across that notion when I was reading an article and someone brought that up. I thought, well, obviously that's not the case, that it is not God being evil here. But how do we make this, how do we get clearer here? Well, I looked at this Greek word that's used, and I saw it used in a few different ways, translated a few different ways throughout the New Testament. First of all, in verses 1 and 3, it's translated as tempted in verse 1. In verse 3, it comes out as the tempter came and said to him and starts trying to tempt Jesus. But you actually see this translated in other passages as test. When referring to Jesus, for instance, in John chapter 6, in verse 5 beginning, as he is testing his disciples, it said, he asks Philip, where are we to buy bread so that these may eat? Talking about the crowd that was around them. This he was saying to test him, for he himself knew what he was intending to do. Now, are we going to look at this passage? It's the same Greek word. Are we going to look at this passage and say, well, God really is the one that was tempting, because this is God manifested in the flesh. He's tempting someone to do. No. Obviously, that's not the case. He is testing his disciples. Well, you go beyond that in 2 Corinthians chapter 13, in verse 5, same word again. It says, test yourselves to see if you are in the faith. Examine yourselves. Or do you not recognize this about yourselves, that Jesus Christ is in you, unless indeed you fail the test? Kind of reminds me a lot of what Paul was saying in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. But here again, Paul is certainly not saying, well, when it comes to trying to bolster yourself up against sin and trying to resist sin, what you need to do is get around it as much as possible and allow yourself to be seduced by it in the first place. Obviously, we just read yesterday in 1 Corinthians chapter 6 that he says the exact opposite. He said, flee from it, escape from it. And so we're not talking about entertaining sin here or temptation. So where's the distinction? You keep on going past that. Revelation chapter 2. Very quickly, Revelation chapter 2 and verse 2. Jesus, writing to the 7 churches, he says, I know your deeds and your toil and perseverance, and that you cannot tolerate evil men. And you put to the test those who call themselves apostles, and they are not, and you found them to be false. Here's a situation, again, the same word, but they put some to the test. And what was the result? Why did they do that? Because they needed to know who was actually of sound faith, who was honest and sincere, and who were just wolves in sheep's clothing. And so they put them to the test in that way. That's how the word is used. Going down just a few verses after that, in verse 10, he says, do not fear what you're about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to cast some of you into prison, so that you will be tested, and you will have tribulation for 10 days. Be faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life. Finally, in chapter 3 and verse 10, he says, because you have kept the word of my perseverance, I also will keep you from the hour of testing, that hour which is about to come upon the whole world to test those who dwell on the earth. Now that word testing there earlier in the verse, I don't know if that's tied to the same word. It's not the same word. It may just be that it has the same root word, but it's conjugated a different way. I don't know about that. But what's highlighted there at the very end of the verse, that is the same word that we've been questioning. The same word that's translated as tempted, or the tempter, in Matthew chapter 4. Well, I think when it comes to trying to square that in our minds, since it is the same word, I think the distinction seems to be the context of what we're reading. At least it tends to be. I think we can tell that just from what we're reading. But for instance, look in James chapter 1. The same word being used in verse 13 as we read yesterday. It says, let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is carried away and enticed by his own lust. And then you get into that idea of how sin is conceived and how death is produced. And remember what we said, it takes two parties. It takes this willing party to conceive with temptation. And so, again, I think it's even here within the context, because you go just a few verses prior to that, at the very beginning of the chapter. Reading in verse 2 of James chapter 1, he says, consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. I think ultimately the distinction that we have to make, what helps us understand, how this word is used, when it is used, is what is the intended result. When Satan tempts, his goal is to bring us to hell. His goal is our destruction. But there is a sense in which we are tested at times where we're not being tempted by God, although that may be what the devil wants, but we're being tested. Here's an opportunity that we have to prove God, to prove God right. I just can't help but think about the story of Job. You remember the beginning of the story of Job? Job had no idea what was going on. But do you notice what God says about Job? He points him out. He points him out over all others. And he says, have you considered my servant Job? Have you seen this blameless man? He truly does care about him. And here comes the adversary coming in, trying to bring him down and say, well, that's just because he has all of these things. But in the first couple of chapters there, even after all of those things are taken away, he doesn't curse God and die. But rather, he blesses the Lord after all of those things. And so here's a situation where the devil, he really wants to use all of these things to tear Job down and to bring destruction to him and ultimately bring shame to God and make sure that God has a loss. Well, Job, at least in the first couple of chapters there, he proves God right. And wouldn't that be such a beautiful notion? What if God came to you, and this is just a hypothetical, obviously, but can you imagine if God came to you and said, I'm going to use you. I'm going to use you specifically as an example in a fight against Satan, against the adversary, and you're going to suffer many things. But I'm going to use you for my victory. I don't know. I'd be very terrified. And that's just because we know the story of Job, and we know the things that he suffered, we know the things that he went through. But he was tested, and after that test, at least at the very beginning, we can talk more about towards the end some of the language that's used by Job himself, but at the beginning, he proves God right as a righteous servant, one who would bless God instead of curse him and die after he's lost all these things. And so I think it's the same thing. Are we willing to be tested in that way? And ultimately, as we see in the example of Jesus, I think we absolutely do find someone who is willing to be tested in that way, willing to suffer to prove God right? Well, as we continue on, let's just look back at Matthew chapter 4. Let's think specifically about the tactics that Satan tries to use, and just focusing in on just the first temptation tonight. And we'll focus on the other two in the next couple of nights. But in verse 3 of Matthew chapter 4, it's interesting that in the first two temptations, he starts the same way. You haven't even proven yourself. If you are the Son of God, command that these stones become bread. If you are the Son of God, if you really are the Messiah, well then, why don't you just go ahead and fill your hunger? Why don't you fulfill this need that you have to give yourself energy so that you keep on living? I've read through this before, especially when I first read through this. I kept wondering, what's the problem here? Obviously there's a problem, because Satan, everything he said, nothing he says is trustworthy. So obviously there's a problem. But what is the problem here? Jesus is turning stones to bread to fill this human need. Well, I think ultimately you find it in the answer that Jesus gives. As he quotes from Deuteronomy chapter 8, as you look at the context of the quotation, I think you find especially what Jesus is trying to say. Deuteronomy chapter 8 in verse 2, again, he says, "You shall remember all the way which the Lord your God has led you in the wilderness, these 40 years, that he might humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his word, his commandments or not." And yet again, here you see that idea of testing. He humbled you and let you be hungry, and fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you understand that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by everything that proceeds out of the mouth of the Lord. So what was the problem here? What is the temptation? Ultimately, he's trying to tempt, as you see on the slide, Jesus to act outside of his Father's will. God has not commanded that of man. And here you see something that is so admirable, that is so beautiful from Jesus. Jesus essentially says, I would rather starve to death before making another step without my Father's will, without knowing that that is what my Father wants for me. I am not willing to move unless he has revealed it to me. That is a beautiful thought. And that is the same conviction, the same resolve that we are supposed to have. That we are willing to sit there, not just fasting, not just to go hungry, but we are willing to sit there and go through the same persecutions that Jesus went through. Not for our own pride, but for God's victory. That is what we ultimately should be like, just like Jesus, just like the Christ, as we see in his example. Every temptation that ultimately you find in every single one, Satan tries to get Christ to act independently of God's will. He tries to get him to meet legitimate needs through illegitimate ways. Do people still do that today? Absolutely. Especially in the religious world. So what do I mean by that? How do people still try to meet what are legitimate needs through illegitimate ways? Well, you know what? We need to worship God. That's a commandment. We have to worship God, and you know what? We need to make sure that it's worthy of God's time. We need to make sure that it's worthy to be offered up to God. And so what are we going to do? I know what we're going to do. We're going to get a whole choir up here, up on a stage, and then we're going to add a whole bunch of instruments. And you know what? We're going to go even further than that. We're going to put a whole bunch of interesting lights on the ceilings and get a fog machine in there. Oh, goodness. We're going to make this so cool. And this is going to be really worthy of God's time. Oh, is that an acceptable offering before the Lord? Is that a sweet-smelling aroma before the Lord? Absolutely not. And you want to know why? Very simply because God has not told us to do that. He's told us what to do. But what do people often try to do? They try to add all these things. Again, they're trying to meet legitimate needs. God needs to be worshipped. He needs to be worshipped in hymns and spiritual songs. But not that way. God has not told us to do it that way. And this is kind of a side point. Sometimes I get distracted. But sometimes people say, especially when you're talking about instrumental music, well, but it was used in the Old Testament. Okay, well, there's an example of them following the pattern that God has given them. What's the pattern God has given us today? That's the point. And you could go even further down that path, but ultimately that is the main point that I'm trying to make here, particularly in the answer of Jesus. He is not willing to follow just any pattern. And he's not willing to just follow his own inclinations or his own whims. He does everything that the Father wants him to do. That is his goal. That is his food. That's his sustenance, as we'll look at in John chapter 4 in just a moment. And so, just because there is a legitimate need that needs to be fulfilled, that doesn't mean we get to just go about it in any way we want. We have to make sure that we're still residing within the prescribed way, the revealed Word of God. That's just as important today as it was 2,000 years ago. If it was important for Jesus to do that, oh, wow, is it still important for us today? Because let me tell you, I'm not willing to sit there. I am not confident enough, brave enough to sit up here and say that I think I can do it just as good or that I think I can do it better than Jesus. May I never say that. I want to have the exact same kind of resolve that he had when facing that kind of affliction. Well, moving beyond that, if you want to turn to 1 John chapter 2 very quickly. 1 John chapter 2. This really has to do with all three temptations. But in 1 John chapter 2, what we find is something that I think is pretty helpful in helping us understand just how deeply impacted Jesus would have been when it comes to all of these temptations. Beginning in verse 15 of 1 John chapter 2, beginning in verse 15, it says, "Do not love the world, nor the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world," now notice the three things that he mentions. "The lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the boastful pride of life is not from the Father, but it is from the world. The world is passing away and also its lusts, but the one who does the will of God lives forever." Do those three things sound familiar? We actually read a passage earlier this week that really goes through the exact same three things when it comes to particularly the very first sin. Back over in Genesis chapter 3 very quickly, in verse 6, when the serpent is tempting Eve, and he's saying all of these things, trying to deceive Eve, and ultimately he succeeds in deceiving her. But what does it say that the woman saw? In verse 6, it says, when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable to make one wise, she took from its fruit and ate. What was it that deceived her? What was it that caught her? Well, it was everything that we read in 1 John chapter 2. It was the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the boastful pride of life. I think ultimately when we're boiling things down, that is the main tactics that Satan uses to try and get us to stray from God's will. Now it's the same thing I would kind of say about the greatest commandments. Now, are there more commandments than just love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and then love your neighbor as yourself? Well, yeah, there are other commandments that we're supposed to obey. I mean, there are several commandments that we could read throughout the New Testament. But boiling everything down, that is where that is the umbrella under which everything else falls. Those two things. And in the same way, you have these three different appeals. I think this is the main way that Satan still tries to tempt us today, in the same ways that we find Christ being tempted in the wilderness. And so in this first instance, what you have is the lust of the flesh being appealed to. What is he trying to tell him to do? Listen, why starve yourself? Why starve yourself? What could possibly be the will of God for you to starve to death out here? What could possibly be the will of your Father? How is this supposed to be a victory for him? And so thankfully, Jesus, though Satan appeals to the weakness of the flesh at its peak, when it was at its worst, how hungry do you think you'd be after 40 days? I've never gone that long. I don't think I've gone 40 minutes. But 40 days and 40 nights of fasting? Oh, that will be a very, very tempting moment. But Jesus remains steadfast, and from the very outset of the temptations, what you find is that Jesus reveals that we don't have to feed the sinful desires. In Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 15, it says about Jesus, "For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in all things as we are, yet without sin." So here's a great comparison made with a great contrast. What is the comparison? Jesus, he has felt all. sometimes people try to act like, it was easier for Jesus. They almost act like he was emotionally bulletproof or maybe emotionally distant. That was not the case. In fact, you find twice throughout the New Testament that it says that Jesus that Jesus weeps for a few different reasons. That he was so affected that he weeps for Jerusalem, that he weeps for a friend that has passed away, that has tasted death. Honestly, I think that is way more than most men like to admit, especially in our culture, in their own lifetimes, in a whole lifetime. Jesus was not emotionally distant. He felt every single emotion that we feel. The difference is, the contrast is, he did not let that emotion, he didn't let it reign supreme. He rather had the will of God always on the forefront of his mind, guiding him so that way the emotions wouldn't take him too far. And that is the main difference between us and Jesus. Not that he didn't really feel all of the temptations. He didn't really have to go through the same struggles that we do. He went through more. Yet he was perfect. What does that say about us? Maybe what does that say about our resolve in the past? And maybe can we do better? I think we absolutely can. So Jesus reveals that we don't have to feed that sinful desire. Not that it was wrong to eat, but it was wrong to go beyond the will of God. That is the main point here. And Jesus was never willing to do that, even if it meant starving himself. So I think that is something to take to heart. Well, finally, within this first tactic, what we find is that Satan strikes at opportune moments. In verse 2, as we've already mentioned, what we see is that he first tried to tempt him after the 40 days and 40 nights, when, as we already said, the weakness of the flesh was at its peak. But you just go over to Luke chapter 4, the parallel account of this, Luke chapter 4, in verse 13. It doesn't say this at the end of Matthew's account, but in Luke chapter 4 and verse 13, look at how Luke ends this. It says, when the devil had finished every temptation, he left him until an opportune time. And the main thing that I want to focus on here is the fact that Satan still tries to strike at those opportune moments. The moments where the flesh is weary and the will is waning. And so we have to look to the example of Jesus so that way we might be bolstered spiritually and emotionally, mentally, so that way we can stand fast in the same way that Jesus did against temptation, though it would be such a striking temptation, to say the very least. Well, I just want to conclude this evening by looking at Jesus' answer in a little bit more depth. First of all, how is it that Jesus resisted in this way when the flesh was so weak? Well, first of all, he didn't forget what the Father has already said. Right before this account in Matthew chapter 4, in verse 17 of chapter 3, after Jesus had been baptized, you see that a voice, it says, behold, a voice out of the heavens said, this is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. And it's right after that in Matthew's account that you get into the temptations in the wilderness. I think that is worthy to be noted, because for me, what better encouragement than to hear those words, that kind of reassurance given by the Father himself to the Son. Jesus, I don't think as he goes through these temptations, I don't think he just forgets those words very easily. I don't think he ever forgot those words, even while he was on the cross. What is one of the last things he says? But to fulfill the prophecy, he said, I thirst, and into your hands I commit my spirit. Never, even when he was in the full throes of pain, did he forget his Father and his will. And we've already seen that as we've looked at the tactics of Satan, how the reason he stood so firm is because he cared more about the will of the Father than the will of the flesh. Well, going beyond that, he truly believed that God was all he needed. He quotes Deuteronomy chapter 8, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. In John chapter 4 and verse 34, Jesus says to his disciples, my food is, well, it's kind of a humorous situation, because this is right after he talks to the Samaritan woman. She leaves and she's excited because she knows who Jesus is. He is the Messiah. He's that king that they've been waiting for. The disciples come and they start talking about food. They're like, well, who brought him food? Jesus kind of corrects the notion here. My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work. That's my food. What is he saying? That is what keeps me going. My sustenance is God's will and nothing more. Again, I just want to ask, can we say that? Sometimes you look at a passage like 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 1, where Paul says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. I believe that he could say that fully confident because he really did live that way. He was trying to imitate Christ. Could I say that right now? Could you say that at this moment in your life and say, I confidently can say that and tell people to imitate me because I really am striving to imitate the example of Christ? In the same way, could we say this like Jesus said it? My will is not to be more successful in sports. My goal, my will is not fed by ambition to be in academic prestige or even career promotion. My will, my sustenance, is to do the will of my Father. That is an important question to ask ourselves as we look at the example of Jesus. Well, finally, I think ultimately one of the main points here, and this is something I want to just keep kind of pounding in on as we go throughout the next few nights, is that Jesus was not someone who was ever caught off guard. And what I mean by that is, he was prepared for these moments before he got to them. So many times you have people who may talk a big game, say, well, I know how to respond in the moments when temptation does come, even when I am weary, but they never prepare for it. They never work for it beforehand. It's kind of like the guy who thinks, on July 1st, I'm going to max out on bench press or squat or something. I think Kyler can probably understand that better than anyone else in this room. But, on July 1st, I'm giving myself a deadline. I'm going to max out on the bench press. And if you never get on the bench press and lift weights at all throughout that next year, guess what? You try to put 400 pounds on that dude, you're getting crushed. You're going to break your neck. Because you haven't built up the strength, you haven't built up the muscles to be able to do that, to be able to hold that kind of weight. What are we doing spiritually when we say, I know that I can stand firm against that kind of temptation? When we are not preparing by reading through the scriptures, reading the very mind of God, in the same way that Jesus would have, continually thinking about him, continually praying to God, losing sleep just to pray to his Father. Do me and you, do we have that same kind of ambition when it comes to the spiritual things? And so that's something that I just want to keep going through, particularly that notion of, are we preparing ourselves in the same way as Jesus would have? He was never caught off guard. Will we be caught off guard? Or are we working now to make sure that we will prove to be true to God when tested at our weakest? You may be a Christian already. If you're not currently working on that, I would just say you can start now. You can start building that knowledge now. You can start having studies with one of the elders here, with Brother Tom. I'm sure that he is not someone who would wince at someone asking for a Bible study. You have brothers and sisters here that would love to help you in that. Are you trying to build your trust in the Father? Finally, I would say if you're not a Christian, the first step towards being prepared in those kinds of moments, those very trying moments, is by becoming a Christian. Are you even that far ahead? Or are you prepared at least in that way? If you're not, we can help you with that. If there's any way that you are subject to the invitation of Christ,